By the mid-1760s, the town of Boston was not merely a location on a map. It was a living, breathing organism, a vital imperial port that pulsated with a restless, nervous energy. It was a place of extreme contrasts, crowded tenements leaning over opulent merchant estates, the smell of expensive spices from the East Indies mingling with the stench of the mudflats at low tide. This was the jewel of the British Empire in the Americas, yet beneath its prosperous surface, a tectonic shift was occurring. Trade was the lifeblood that fueled its meteoric growth, but power, raw, imperial, and increasingly heavy-handed, was what shaped its narrow, winding streets. Imagine standing on the cobblestones of King Street during this era. You would hear the cacophony of a dozen different dialects, the rhythmic hammering of shipwrights, and the distant, haunting chime of church bells. But you would also feel something else, an unseen pressure building like steam in a boiler. Few residents realized it at the time, but they were standing on a brink. The city was about to be transformed from a loyal colonial outpost into the epicenter of a global ideological earthquake. Our goal today is not merely to observe this transition from the safety of the present, but to immerse ourselves in it, to walk through Boston's past as if the revolution hasn't happened yet, as if the future is still a terrifying, beautiful unknown. To understand the fire of the 1760s, we must first understand the frost of the 1630s. The story of Boston begins with the Winthrop fleet, a group of souls who did not come seeking gold, but seeking a sanctuary for their spirits. When John Winthrop and his followers first stepped onto the rugged, uneven shores of the Shawmut Peninsula, they were met not with the infrastructure of a city, but with the daunting silence of the wilderness. They arrived with a singular, burning intention, yet they possessed absolutely no certainty of survival. Every step onto those unfamiliar shores was a gamble with providence. In those early years, Boston was not a city, it was a fragile beginning, a precarious idea carried across the treacherous Atlantic in the hulls of wooden ships. Survival and belief were inextricably intertwined. To starve was to fail God, to thrive was to prove the righteousness of their city upon a hill. They battled harsh winters that claimed lives with indifferent cruelty, yet they continued to build. They were architects of a new world, moving with a tentative but desperate resolve. This era was defined by the Great Migration, a period where the demographic foundation of New England was laid not by conquerors, but by families, artisans, and ministers who viewed the Massachusetts Bay as a literal promised land. As the settlement took root, the chaos of survival began to give way to the structure of society. The first meeting house emerged as Boston's earliest anchor, a physical manifestation of the Puritan soul. It was a building of stark, uncompromising simplicity, plain, practical, and central. It was here that the boundaries between the sacred and the secular dissolved. In this one space, the community gathered to pray to their Creator on Sundays and to argue about livestock, land boundaries, and local taxes on Mondays. This structure reflected a settlement focused on order, faith, and collective survival. It was the civic heart, a place where the individual was secondary to the Commonwealth. Interestingly, the location of these early meeting houses foreshadows the modern layout of Boston. Even today, as you navigate the glass and steel canyons of the financial district, you are often walking the same paths established by these early settlers. The city's original footprint was dictated by the need to be close to the meeting house, ensuring that no soul was ever too far from the watchful eye of the community or the word of the law. If we look back at the early engravings of the late 17th century, we see a Boston that feels almost experimental. It was a modest settlement of wooden buildings that seemed to huddle together for warmth against the vastness of the Atlantic. The roads were little more than muddy tracks, rutted by ox carts and washed out by the tides. Ships hugged the shore, their masts looking like a leafless forest against the gray sky. Life moved slowly and precariously. At this stage, Boston did not yet possess the swagger of a world-class port. It felt more like a tentative foothold, a colonial experiment that could still be swept away by a bad harvest, a disease, or a shift in imperial policy. Every house was a fire hazard, every voyage was a risk. Yet within this modesty, there was a growing sense of permanence. The wooden chimneys were replaced by brick. The muddy tracks were slowly paved with beach stones. The residents were no longer just English subjects living abroad. They were becoming Bostonians, a people defined by their resilience and their burgeoning sense of local identity. By the 1720s, the tentative foothold had vanished, replaced by a recognizable roaring harbor town. This was the era when Boston truly found its voice in the global choir of commerce. Ships from London, the West Indies, and Africa crowded the waters of the harbor, their hulls filled with molasses, rum, timber, and fine silks. Commerce was no longer just a means of survival. It was the engine of expansion and the driver of a new colonial aristocracy. The most striking symbol of this newfound confidence was the construction of Long Wharf. Extending boldly and aggressively into the deep water of the harbor, it was a massive engineering feat for its time. Long Wharf was more than just a pier. It was an announcement to the world. It signaled that Boston was the primary gateway to the American continent, a hub where the riches of the interior met the power of the Atlantic world. This was a city that had transitioned from a religious retreat to a commercial powerhouse, where the ledger book began to sit comfortably alongside the Bible. As the wealth of the harbor flowed into the streets, the skyline of Boston began to change. Church steeples rose high behind the busy docks, their elegant spires signaling neighborhood identities and social stability. These were not just places of worship, they were landmarks of arrival. From the Old South Meeting House to the Brattle Street Church, these structures represented the fact that Boston was no longer a temporary camp. It was rooted. Offshore, the appearance of Boston Light, the first lighthouse in the Americas, further symbolized this endurance. Its beam, cutting through the fog and the nor'easters, guided ships home and served as a silent guardian of the city's prosperity. These structures suggested a city that believed in its own future, a city that felt it had weathered the worst of the storms. However, this sense of permanence was built on a foundation of imperial loyalty that was about to be tested in ways the builders of these steeples could never have imagined. While the church steeples pointed toward heaven, the guns of Castle William pointed toward the horizon. Situated at the entrance to the harbor, this formidable fortress stood as a constant, looming reminder that Boston existed under the watchful and sometimes heavy hand of imperial control. It was a site of paradox. It provided the protection of the British Navy, the most powerful force on Earth, yet it also represented the ultimate constraint. For the residents of Boston, Castle William was a visual manifestation of their relationship with the king. Opportunity and authority coexisted in its shadow. As long as the interests of the crown and the colonists aligned, the fortress was a comforting sight. But as the 1760s progressed and the crown began to view its colonies as a source of revenue rather than a partner in trade, those guns began to look less like a shield and more like a threat. The presence of the military at the city's edge shaped how residents understood their own freedom. They were free only so long as the empire allowed them to be. Across the Charles River, in the quiet village of Cambridge, Harvard College represented the intellectual soul of the region. In the early 18th century, its buildings were modest, functional, and largely unassuming. It was a place designed to train ministers, to ensure that the city upon a hill never lacked for educated leadership. Yet within those brick walls, something far more radical was occurring. The curriculum, though rooted in tradition, began to absorb the ideas of the Enlightenment. Students and professors began to debate the nature of natural rights, the social contract, and the limits of sovereign power. Harvard became a nursery for the ideas that would eventually challenge the very empire that had fostered the college. The quiet ambition found in these classrooms was not for wealth, but for understanding. The young men who walked these halls, the Adamses, the Otises, the Hancocks, were learning how to articulate a grievance into a philosophy. They were the intellectual architects of a revolution that was still decades away. In the heart of the city stood the old State House, the most important building in the colony. This was the center of civic life, a place where royal governors met with local representatives, where laws were debated, and where the king's authority was physically manifested in the lion and the unicorn perched upon its roof. It was here that abstract imperial policy from London became lived experience for the people of Boston. Inside its chambers, the friction between local needs and imperial demands grew increasingly heated. When the British Parliament passed the Stamp Act or the Townshend Acts, the The protests didn't just happen in the streets. They happened here in the halls of governance. The old state house was a crucible where the old world of monarchical rule met the new world of representative democracy. It was the stage upon which the drama of the American identity was first performed, often with explosive results. If the old State House was the brain of the city, Boston Common was its lungs. It functioned as the shared ground, a place where cows grazed, where children played, and where the community gathered for public announcements. But by the late 1760s, the atmosphere of the Common had changed. It had become a parade field for British soldiers, the Redcoats. The sight of professional soldiers drilling in the heart of a civilian town was a constant, abrasive irritation. Authority was no longer an abstract concept. It was a man with a bayonet standing in your way as you walked to market. The Common became a flashpoint for daily friction. Civilians and soldiers jostled one another on the footpaths. Insults were traded. Tensions simmered. This embedding of military force into the daily routines of the people turned resentment into a way of life. The Common, once a symbol of shared community, became a symbol of a city under occupation. Everything changed on the cold night of December 16, 1773. We often think of the Boston Tea Party as a moment of theatrical, chaotic rebellion, but the reality was far more chilling and calculated. In a city where the Sons of Liberty had been organizing for years, the destruction of the tea was a masterpiece of political defiance. There was no shouting, no looting of other cargo, no violence against the crews. In a near-unearthly silence, hundreds of chests of East India Company tea were hoisted onto the decks and smashed open. The only sound was the rhythmic thud of hatchets and the splash of tea hitting the frigid water. In that silence, a line was crossed that could never be uncrossed. What had been a series of protests and petitions had become an irreversible act of property destruction against the crown. It was the moment the colonists stopped asking for their rights and started asserting their sovereignty. While the public squares echoed with oratory, the real work of the revolution was happening in the shadows. Inside the Green Dragon Tavern, the atmosphere was thick with pipe smoke and the low murmur of conspirators. This was the headquarters of the revolution, a place where the likes of Paul Revere and Joseph Warren met to plan the unthinkable. The revolution here was informal, human, and deeply uncertain. These were not statues in a park. They were tradesmen, doctors, and printers who were risking the gallows. They debated strategy, organized intelligence networks, and managed the logistics of resistance. The Green Dragon reminds us that history is not made by inevitable forces, but by groups of flawed, courageous people talking in taverns, trying to figure out how to change a world that seemed stacked against them. When the clandestine plans of the taverns needed a public voice, they moved to Faneuil Hall. This cradle of liberty was where private anger was transformed into collective resolve. It was a massive open space where the town's inhabitants, regardless of their wealth, could gather to hear the greatest orators of the age. Imagine the roar of 1,000 voices inside those walls as Samuel Adams or James Otis decried the tyranny of unrepresented taxation. Faneuil Hall was where opinion became momentum. It was where the disparate grievances of individuals were forged into a singular, powerful movement. The hall didn't just host meetings, it created a public identity. It was here that the people of Boston realized that they were not just a mob, but a political body with the power to challenge an empire. Fast forward through the blood and fire of the Revolutionary War to the year 1789. The transformation of Boston was complete. In place of the tension and the redcoats, there was a triumphal arch erected for the visit of George Washington, now the president of a sovereign nation. This moment marked a profound shift in purpose. The streets that once echoed with the shouts of no taxation without representation now echoed with cheers for a unified republic. Washington's visit was more than a parade. It was a confirmation that the struggle had been worth it. The experimental foothold of the 1630s and the vital port of the 1760s had produced something tangible, a nation built on the ideas first debated in the taverns and meeting houses of Boston. The city had found its new identity as a pillar of the United States. In the midst of these grand political shifts, we find Christ Church, better known today as the Old North Church. It stands as a profound reminder that history often unfolds in ordinary, quiet spaces. On a routine night in April 1775, this church was just another building in the North End. But because of two lanterns hung in its steeple, it became a signal point that changed the course of human history. The city's fabric absorbs history without announcing it. The bricks of the Old North didn't change after that night, but the meaning of those bricks did. It teaches us that any space, a church, a tavern, a street corner, can become a theater of destiny depending on the choices of the people within it. History is often recognized only in hindsight, but it is built in the now. Today, if you stand at the corner of State and Congress streets, you are standing at a crossroads of centuries. The final comparison between Boston's past and present reveals a fascinating dialogue. The shorelines have been reshaped by massive landfill projects. The muddy roads are now multi-lane arteries, and skyscrapers of glass dwarf the once mighty church steeples. Yet certain anchors remain. The old State House still stands, now surrounded by the towering symbols of global finance. The Common is still a place for the people, though the only soldiers there now are statues. Boston's modern life continues to pulse atop its revolutionary foundations. The decisions made by the Puritans in the 1630s and the Patriots in the 1770s still dictate the rhythm of the city. We live in the house they built, walking the paths they cleared when the future was nothing but a fog. As we reflect on this journey through Boston's evolution, there is a lesson for each of us to carry into our daily lives. The foundations you lay today determine the heights you can reach tomorrow. The settlers of Boston didn't know they were building a world power. They were just trying to survive the winter. The Patriots didn't know they would win. They just knew they couldn't live with a lie. My advice to you is this: treat your ordinary actions with historical weight. The way you stand up for a principle, the way you build your community, and the way you handle uncertainty are the bricks of your own legacy. You may not see the triumphal arch of your life yet, but every meeting house you build in your mind and every long wharf of ambition you extend into the unknown is shaping your future. Thank you for traveling through time with us. If you enjoyed this immersive experience, please subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves the deep stories of our past. Until next time.